Have you ever heard of a young woman who transformed her home into a sanctuary and her garden into a place of prayer? In the warm lands of Lima, Peru, a girl was born, destined to become the first saint of the New World. Isabel Flores de Oliva, universally known as Saint Rose of Lima, blossomed as a miracle of holiness in the 17th century, leaving behind a legacy of sanctity that endures to this day. Her extraordinary devotion, her incredible sacrifices, and her unconditional love for God and the needy made her a beacon of hope for all of the Americas. Today, we will journey through the life of this admirable woman whose existence continues to inspire millions of faithful around the world. Chapter 1. The birth of a heavenly flower, the city of Lima, jewel of the viceroyalty of Peru, basked in the spring sunshine of April 20th, 1586, when in the home of Gaspar Flores and Maria de Oliva, a girl was born. She was baptized Isabel. Divine providence had chosen this American land, newly won for the Catholic faith, to nurture one of the most sublime souls the universal church would ever venerate. The birth of the little girl was greeted with immense joy by her parents, unaware that this child was destined for the highest peaks of sanctity. The Lord, in his infinite wisdom, wished to manifest from the beginning that this girl belonged to him in a special way. When little Isabel was just 3 months old, her mother and her nursemaid watched in astonishment as her face miraculously transformed into a delicate rose. This prodigy, witnessed by other family members as well, was the reason why they began to call her Rosa, a name that would forever replace Isabel, and by which she would be universally known throughout the centuries. Rosa's childhood was marked by extraordinary signs that foreshadowed her future sanctity. Unlike other children, she showed unusual patience in the face of pain and a serenity surprising for her age. It is said that during a procedure to remove a small growth behind her ear, the girl shed not a single tear nor uttered a complaint, already manifesting the spirit of sacrifice that would characterize her entire life. Those who witnessed this event were deeply impressed by the supernatural strength of that little girl. The Flores de Oliva home, though modest in material possessions, was rich in Christian virtues. Doña Maria raised her children in the Catholic faith with diligence and devotion, sowing in Rosa's heart the seeds of piety that would bear such abundant fruit. The little girl listened attentively to stories of Jesus and the saints, showing a special devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, whom she began to emulate in her purity and humility from a very young age. The streets of colonial Lima witnessed the first steps of the one who would be their patron saint and heavenly protector. Amidst the games of childhood, Rosa already dedicated moments to silent prayer, withdrawing to solitary corners to speak with God. Neighbors and acquaintances of the family commented with admiration on the modesty and quietness of this girl, who seemed to already live in another dimension, more attentive to heavenly realities than to earthly amusements. No one could imagine that this little flower would become the first canonized saint of the New World. Chapter 2. A Blessed Childhood. Rosa's early years unfolded under the protection of her family home, where she shone with her own light due to her exemplary obedience and inclination toward piety. At the age of 5, Rosa gave unequivocal signs of her preference for a life of prayer when, inspired by the stories of Saint Catherine of Siena that her mother told her, she made her first vow of virginity, promising Jesus that she would be his forever. This act, performed with the innocence of her age but with supernatural determination, marked the course of her entire existence. Little Rosa soon showed her love for solitude and contemplation. While other girls her age enjoyed games and diversions typical of childhood, she sought secluded places in her garden where she built small shrines with stones and branches. Adorning them with wildflowers, there she spent long hours in intimate conversation with Jesus and the Virgin Mary, thus beginning a life of contemplation that would deepen over time. Rosa's natural gifts did not go unnoticed by those around her. Endowed with exceptional beauty and a keen intelligence, she learned to read and write easily, devoting herself with special interest to the study of the Catechism and the lives of the saints. Her father, Don Gaspar, proud of his daughter's qualities, dreamed of a bright future for her in Lima society, unaware that God's plans for Rosa were very different from human plans. Trials began early for the future saint. A serious illness confined her to bed for several months, causing intense pain that the little girl endured with admirable patience and without complaint. During this period of suffering, Rosa discovered the redemptive value of pain offered out of love for the crucified Christ. Far from rebelling against illness, she embraced it as a precious gift that united her more closely to her divine spouse, thus beginning the path of self-denial that would characterize her whole life. Rosa's Marian devotion manifested itself in tender conversations with the Blessed Virgin Mary, whom she considered her true mother and teacher. Before an image of Our Lady, the girl spent hours contemplating Mary's face, learning from her the virtues of humility, purity, and obedience to the divine will. This filial love for the Mother of God would become one of the fundamental pillars of her spirituality, inspiring her to imitate Marian virtues and to seek, like the Virgin, to please the Lord in everything. Thus, amidst prayers and small acts of self-denial, passed the blessed years of childhood of the one who would be the most fragrant rose of the American garden. Chapter 3. The Lord's Call. Entering adolescence. Rosa experienced with greater clarity the inner call to a life of special consecration. The words of the psalm resonated in her heart. Listen, my daughter, and see, and incline thine ear. Forget also thine own people and thy father's house. So shall the king greatly desire thy beauty. This divine message found in Rosa fertile ground, ready to renounce everything to follow Christ. At 12 years old, while fervently praying before the Blessed Sacrament, Rosa felt an inner voice, inviting her to surrender completely to divine love, abandoning any attachment to worldly vanities. Rosa's response to this call was immediate and radical. With a pair of scissors, she cut off her beautiful hair, so admired by her loved ones, offering this sacrifice as a symbol of her detachment from outward beauty and her commitment to the beauty of her soul. This act provoked her mother's anger, who saw her daughter's physical beauty as a gift to be used to secure a good marriage. Thus began a period of family misunderstanding that would test the firmness of her vocation. Doña Maria, eager to see her daughter settled according to the customs of the time, began to introduce potential suitors, organizing social gatherings and insisting that Rosa dress elegantly and wear jewels and ornaments. The young woman, without disrespecting her parents, found ingenious ways to remain faithful to her purpose of consecration under the elegant dresses her mother forced her to wear. Rosa wore rough cilice, mortifying her flesh, and the jewels adorning her hands contrasted with the secret penances she offered for the conversion of sinners. The family conflict reached its peak when Rosa definitively rejected an advantageous marriage proposal that would have solved the family's economic problems. Faced with her parents' insistence, the young woman then revealed the vow of virginity she had made in her childhood and her firm decision to belong exclusively to Christ. The providential intervention of her confessor, who confirmed the authenticity of Rosa's vocation, finally helped her parents accept, though with sorrow, their daughter's decision. Confirmed in her call to consecrated life, Rosa sought to enter the monastery of the Dominican nuns of Santa Clara. However, God's designs were different. Seemingly insurmountable obstacles prevented her entry into the convent, leading her to understand that her mission was not to live behind cloister walls, but to sanctify herself in the midst of the world, in her own home, transformed into a monastic cell. This revelation gave her immense peace, understanding that the Lord wanted her as a living witness of holiness in the heart of Lima, like a flower that would perfume the streets of the new world with its virtue, a light, like that of Saint Catherine of Siena, shining brightly in the darkness. Chapter 4. The Dominican Influence. The providential encounter with the Dominican family would forever mark Rosa's spiritual path. It was in the church of Santo Domingo in Lima, where the young woman began to frequent liturgical celebrations, drawn to the theological depth and spiritual fervor of the friar preachers. The fervent word of those sons of Saint Dominic, who admirably combined contemplation and study, resonated in Rosa's heart like an echo of God's own voice. Soon, the Dominican church became her second home, where she spent long hours in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament and the image of the Virgin of the Rosary. It was also through the Dominicans that Rosa discovered the figure who would become her spiritual model par excellence, Saint Catherine of Siena. The life of this great Italian mystic of the 14th century, a Dominican tertiary as she aspired to be, had a decisive influence on the spirituality of the Limian saint. Like Catherine, Rosa would embrace a life of extraordinary austerity. Like her, she would dedicate herself to the care of the sick and needy. Like her, she would experience mystical espousals with Christ and receive exceptional mystical gifts. Her identification with St. Catherine became so profound that Rosa constantly invoked her as her protector and teacher on the path to perfection. The spiritual guidance of the Dominican fathers proved providential for Rosa. Among them, Father Juan de Lorenzana, with supernatural wisdom, discerned the authenticity of her vocation. When many, including priests and religious, doubted the advisability of the extraordinary penances the young woman imposed on herself, or suspected possible illusions in her mystical experiences, Father Lorenzana, enlightened by God, recognized in Rosa the unmistakable signs of genuine holiness. Under his prudent guidance, the Limean Virgin advanced with sure steps along the paths of evangelical perfection, wisely balancing ascetic rigor with the sweetness of charity. The decision to wear the habit of the Third Order of Saint Dominic was not taken lightly, nor without difficulties. Rosa had to overcome the resistance of her family, especially her mother, who still harbored hopes of seeing her established according to the social customs of the time. She also faced the skepticism of those who considered her religious fervor excessive for a young woman of her age and position. However, with the help of her spiritual directors, and after a period of discernment and testing, she finally received the Dominican habit, which she would wear with immense dignity until her death, as a visible sign of her consecration to God. Dominican spirituality centered on the pillars of truth, contemplation, and preaching, found in Rosa an original interpreter. Without being a cloistered nun or an itinerant preacher, the Limian saint perfectly embodied the charism of the order of preachers. Her contemplative life in the midst of the world, her love for the truth manifested in the doctrinal clarity of her spiritual counsels, and her silent preaching through the example of her heroic virtues made her a true daughter of Saint Dominic. The friar preachers, for their part, recognized in that young tertiary an exquisite fruit of the Dominican tree planted in American lands, and presented her with pride as proof of the spiritual fecundity of the order in the New World, a testament to the power of faith, unwavering. Chapter 5. Bride of Christ. At 20, in an act of profound spiritual significance, Rosa donned the habit of the Third Order of Saint Dominic, publicly consecrating herself as the Bride of Christ. The ceremony, simple but moving, took place in the church of Santo Domingo in Lima, where the young woman professed vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The Dominican habit, white as the purity of her soul and black as her renunciation of the world, would from then on become her only attire, a visible symbol of her alliance with her divine spouse, a union as profound as that of Saint Rose of Lima with her divine beloved. After her religious profession, Rosa intensified her life of prayer and penance. With her parents' permission, she built a small hermitage in her garden, barely enough to hold her body, where she spent long hours in contemplation, a quiet, dedicated life lived for God. This tiny shrine, built with her own hands, became the stage for the most sublime mystical encounters between the saint and her beloved. There, away from the world's clamor, Rosa conversed with Christ, offering him the flowers of her self-denial and receiving in return the delights of spiritual union. Rosa's relationship with Jesus reached heights of intimacy, experienced only by the greatest mystics. Christ manifested himself to her in various ways, whether through inner locutions, visions, or ecstatic raptures. In one of these manifestations, the divine spouse spoke words that would forever be etched in her heart. "Rosa of my heart, be my spouse." As a token of this mystical betrothal, Jesus gave her an invisible ring, which the saint clearly perceived on her finger, a permanent sign of her exclusive belonging to God. Rosa's devotion to the Blessed Sacrament was extraordinary. She spent hours motionless before the Holy Eucharist, absorbed in loving contemplation. She received communion with such fervor that she often fell into ecstasy, lifted from the ground, to the astonishment of the faithful attending Holy Mass. To prepare herself worthily for this sacramental encounter with her spouse, Rosa fasted rigorously and intensified her prayers, believing that no purification would ever be sufficient to receive the King of Kings into her heart. As a true bride of Christ, Rosa intimately participated in the sufferings of her crucified beloved. She constantly meditated on the passion of the Lord, accompanying him at every moment of his agony, from the Garden of Olives to Calvary. This contemplation was not for her just another pious exercise, but a true communion with the redeeming sufferings of Christ. "My Lord was crowned with thorns. How could I seek comfort?" she repeated when someone tried to lessen her penances. Her identification with the suffering spouse led her to experience in her own body the pains of the Passion, sometimes receiving the extraordinary gift of invisible stigmata, which caused her unspeakable torments, borne with love for the salvation of souls. Chapter 6. Penances and Sacrifices. The penitential life of Saint Rose of Lima reached levels of austerity that amazed even the most experienced spiritual directors of her time. Moved by an ardent love for the crucified Christ and a fervent desire to atone for the sins of the world, the saint subjected her body to extraordinary mortifications that can only be understood from the perspective of her intimate union with God. These practices, far from being an expression of exaggerated rigorism, arose from her deep understanding of the redemptive value of suffering offered out of love. Fasting was one of her principal penances. Rosa ate only what was indispensable to sustain life, abstaining completely from meat and limiting herself to hard bread and water, with the occasional vegetable. During strong liturgical seasons, like Lent and Advent, she intensified this fast to extreme limits, sometimes sustaining herself solely on 5 orange seeds a day and sips of water. This rigorous diet, which would have been impossible without special grace, she offered for the conversion of sinners and the evangelization of the indigenous peoples not yet reached by the light of the gospel. Nightly rest was another opportunity for self-sacrifice for Rosa. She had built herself a bed of wood strewn with pieces of broken pottery and sharp pebbles, upon which she spread a rough blanket. On this bed of pain, she spent the few hours she dedicated to sleep, thus remembering the harsh wood of the cross on which her beloved had expired. Furthermore, she bound her head with a metal crown with inward-pointing sharp points hidden under her veil, in memory of Christ's crown of thorns. These mortifications, performed with the permission of her confessors, were always accompanied by intense prayer, transforming them into acts of love. Discipline and the Silice completed the penitential program of the Limeña saint. 3 times a day, she scourged herself with iron chains until she bled, offering this sacrifice for the souls in purgatory or for the conversion of pagan peoples. On her delicate body, she constantly wore a rough cilice that caused her painful sores, especially at the waist, where she tightened it most forcefully. When her confessors, worried about her health, ordered her to moderate these practices, Rosa obeyed humbly, but begged to be allowed to continue with some form of mortification, considering it unbearable to live without sharing in some way the sufferings of her divine spouse. In addition to these corporal penances, Rosa practiced with extraordinary rigor the mortifications of the senses and the will. She voluntarily deprived herself of anything that might give her pleasure. She avoided looking at the flowers in her garden. Despite her natural inclination towards beauty, she abstained from perfumes and fragrances and rarely allowed music, to which she felt a special attraction, to reach her ears. Her greatest sacrifice, however, was the continuous denial of her own will, submitting herself with perfect obedience to her parents, confessors, and religious superiors, seeing in them representatives of divine authority. The purpose of all these austerities was not the destruction of the body, which Rosa considered the temple of the Holy Spirit, but its perfect subjection to the Spirit. To those who marveled at the severity of her penances, the saint replied simply, "When one loves, one does not feel pain, or if one does feel it, the pain itself is loved." This phrase reveals the secret of her penitential life, a love so great for Christ that transformed suffering into joy and self-sacrifice into spiritual delight. Her mortifications, incomprehensible to the worldly mind, were for her the language of love, the creature's response to the infinite love of the Creator who gave himself up to death on the cross. Chapter 7. The Garden of Virtues. The soul of Saint Rose blossomed like a garden where all the virtues grew in admirable harmony, cultivated with the constant watering of grace and the ardent sun of divine love. Among these virtues, humility stood out as the foundation upon which the whole edifice of her holiness was raised. Rosa considered herself the least of creatures, unworthy of the heavenly favors she received and deserving only of contempt. When someone praised her piety or her works of charity, she replied with sincere conviction, "Do not look at me, poor sinner, but at Christ who works in me despite my misery." Obedience, a favorite virtue of consecrated souls, shone in Rose with special splendor, submissive to her parents, whom she served with filial love in even the smallest details. Docile to her spiritual directors, whose orders she fulfilled exactly even if they contradicted her desires for greater penance. Surrendered to the divine will that she accepted in all circumstances. This Dominican saint had made obedience the rudder guiding her spiritual ship. On one occasion, her confessor, to test the authenticity of her holiness, ordered her to destroy a writing on divine mercies that she had previously drafted. Without the slightest hesitation, Rosa threw those pages that had cost her so much effort, into the fire, demonstrating that she loved God's will as manifested through her superiors more than her own devotions. The angelic purity of Rosa was known throughout Lima. Her modesty in dress, the careful guarding of her senses, and the constant vigilance over her thoughts created around her an atmosphere of chastity that impressed even those furthest from spiritual life. This purity, far from making her insensitive, refined her capacity to truly love. Her heart, consecrated exclusively to Christ, expanded in a universal love that embraced all people, especially those most in need of mercy. Like a lily rooted in the earth, lifting its whiteness towards heaven, Rosa lived in the world without being of the world, radiating the fragrance of her immaculate purity. The patience of the Saint of Lima manifested itself not only in the serene acceptance of illnesses and physical pains, but also in the way she endured misunderstandings, criticisms, and even slander. During a period of her life, when the mystical favors she received began to become noticeable, there were those who questioned the authenticity of her holiness, accusing her of hypocrisy or of being deceived by diabolical illusions. Rosa suffered these trials in silence, never justifying herself and entrusting to God those who criticized her. Her serenity in the face of these tribulations was such that those who dealt with her closely could not help but recognize in her the unmistakable mark of true sainthood. Crowning all these virtues, charity shone in Rosa, queen and form of all the others. Her love for God was manifested in a constant life of prayer, which occupied most of her days and nights. So intense was this love that, as she confessed to her spiritual director, she found it impossible to distract herself from divine thought, even in the midst of the most absorbing occupations. Her charity towards her neighbor was expressed in countless works of mercy. She cared for the sick, consoled the afflicted, instructed the ignorant in the truths of the faith, and despite her extreme poverty, always found ways to help those in need, often depriving herself of her own sustenance to feed the hungry. This charity reached its maximum expression in the continuous offering of prayers, penances, and sufferings for the salvation of souls, especially for the conversion of the indigenous people and the perseverance of the new Christians of the Peruvian viceroyalty. A love that echoes the selfless dedication of a Mother Teresa, a saint whose compassion knew no bounds. Chapter 8. Her mystical writings. The burning words that flowed from Rosa's heart, a heart intimately united with God, were captured in various writings that reveal the depth of her inner life. From a very young age, at the suggestion of her confessors who perceived extraordinary graces in her, she began to write spiritual notes where she recorded her mystical experiences, purposes of perfection, and rules of life. These notes, written in a simple but deeply moving style, reflect the progressive maturation of her soul on the path to union with God. Particularly moving are the resolutions she imposed on herself to grow in humility and self-denial, to always consider myself the last of creatures, to seek in everything the greatest glory of God, to never miss an opportunity to mortify myself for love of Jesus crucified. Among the most beautiful writings of Saint Rosa are her mystical poems, compositions overflowing with lyricism where she expressed through nuptial images her intimate union with Christ the spouse. Like Saint Teresa of Avila, whom she did not know but with whom she shares remarkable spiritual similarities, Rosa used the language of human love to translate the ineffable experience of divine love. "My beloved is mine, and I am my beloved's. Who shall separate me from the love of Christ? I am wounded by love," are some of the expressions that are repeated in these poetic compositions, eloquent testimony of a heart totally possessed by God. These poems, although not originally intended for publication, circulated among the people of her spiritual circle, edifying them and igniting them in divine love, a devotion mirrored in the passionate poetry of many American hymn writers. Despite not having received an academic theological education, Rosa possessed an infused knowledge of divine mysteries that astonished theologians and priests. This supernatural wisdom was manifested in the letters of spiritual direction she wrote to various people who came to her seeking advice. Ladies of Lima's high society, religious tormented by vocational doubts, sinners desiring conversion, all found in Rosa's brief missives, a light that illuminated their particular situations and pointed the way forward. The doctrinal clarity, the sure discernment, and the deep understanding of souls that these letters reveal can only be explained by a special assistance of the Holy Spirit, who had made this humble Dominican tertiary an instrument of his sanctifying action. Among the most significant works of Saint Rosa is her Spiritual Ladder, a short mystical treatise where she described the degrees of union with God, comparing them to the steps of a ladder leading to heaven. Inspired by the traditional doctrine of the Fathers of the Church and her own contemplative experience, Rosa detailed the progressive self-emptying that the soul must undergo to ascend from sensible knowledge to perfect contemplation. What makes this writing especially valuable is the simplicity with which it explains very high spiritual realities, making them accessible to all the faithful. This ability to communicate the ineffable reveals not only the depth of her mystical experience, but also the pedagogical gift with which God had endowed her for the benefit of many souls. A gift that resonates with the simple yet profound teachings of many great American preachers. The authenticity of Rosa's writings was tested by her spiritual directors, as was customary at that time when extreme caution was exercised in the face of mystical phenomena, especially in women. On one occasion, her confessor ordered her to burn some of her manuscripts to test her obedience and detachment, a test of faith that echoes similar trials faced by other great saints throughout history. Saint Rosa of Lima, without a moment's hesitation, threw those pages into the fire, pages where she had poured out her most intimate spiritual experiences, demonstrating that she loved God's will more than her own works. However, divine providence allowed other writings to be saved, preserved as true treasures by those around her who sensed their exceptional value. These manuscripts, along with the testimonies gathered during the canonization process, now constitute an invaluable source for understanding the inner life of this great mystic of the New World. Chapter 9. Miracles and Wonders. The life of Saint Rosa of Lima was filled with extraordinary events, manifesting divine providence's preference for this chosen soul. These supernatural phenomena, which the saint humbly tried to hide, were witnessed by numerous credible people during the canonization process. Among the most frequent were ecstasies, states of such profound absorption in God that they rendered her insensible to all external stimuli. During these mystical experiences, her face was transfigured, acquiring a supernatural beauty, reflecting intimate communion with her beloved. Sometimes, these spiritual raptures were accompanied by levitation, with her being seen raised from the ground while praying before the Blessed Sacrament or contemplating the crucifix in her hermitage. One of the most talked about wonders in Lima was Rosa's gift of attracting irrational creatures, especially birds, who came meekly to her garden. Every morning, at dawn, the saint would go to her hermitage and sing hymns of praise to the Creator. Immediately, flocks of birds of various colors would land on the nearby trees, remaining completely silent for the duration of Rosa's prayer. Then, at her signal, they would begin to sing melodiously, forming a natural choir that accompanied the saint's hymns. This phenomenon, witnessed by many, recalled the paradisiacal harmony between man and nature, restored in Rosa by her extraordinary purity. The miraculous healings performed through the intercession of the Limanian Virgin during her earthly life were numerous. It was enough for her to lay her hands on a sick person or to promise to pray for their recovery, for the most serious illnesses to disappear. Her prayer was especially effective in healing children, for whom she felt a particular fondness. In the neighborhood where the Flores de Oliva family lived, mothers confidently went to Rosa when their little ones fell ill, sure that the intercession of the Dominican saint would obtain the desired healing from heaven. Despite these extraordinary gifts, Rosa always attributed the healings to divine mercy and the faith of the sick, considering herself an unworthy instrument of God's goodness. The ability to penetrate hearts and the knowledge of hidden things were other charisms with which the Holy Spirit had enriched Saint Rosa. On numerous occasions, she surprised her interlocutors by revealing secret thoughts or circumstances of their lives that only they knew. She used this gift solely for the spiritual good of souls, helping sinners to recognize their hidden faults and embark on the path of conversion. Many limeños, impressed by this supernatural ability, came to Rosa's humble cell for spiritual guidance, finding in her a sure guide who pointed them with certainty toward God. Perhaps the most extraordinary wonder in the life of Saint Rosa was the privilege of heavenly visits. The Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to her frequently, instructing her in divine mysteries and consoling her in her tribulations. She also received visits from the child Jesus, with whom she held conversations of unspeakable tenderness. It is said that on one occasion, while Rosa was contemplating an image of the Virgin with the child in her arms, Mary offered her divine son, saying, "Rosa, take care of my son. I must be absent for a moment." The saint took the child Jesus in her arms, experiencing an indescribable joy that left her in ecstasy for hours. These extraordinary favors, far from making her vain, increased her humility, making her recognize more deeply her smallness before the infinite mercy of God, who thus privileged her. Chapter 10. Friend of the poor saint, Rosa's love for the needy was a reflection of Christ's own love, who identified with the least and the suffering. Despite the poverty of her own family, which faced frequent economic difficulties, Rosa always found ingenious ways to help those who suffered greater indigence. She worked tirelessly with her hands, exquisitely embroidering and making artificial flowers that she sold to obtain resources that she almost entirely dedicated to charitable works. Many times, upon returning home, she would remove her cloak to cover a beggar shivering in the streets of Lima. The Flores de Oliva family home, thanks to Rosa's influence, became a true makeshift hospital. With her parents' permission, especially her mother, who shared her charitable spirit, the saint welcomed abandoned sick people, homeless elderly, and orphaned children who could not find a place in the city's few hospitals. She washed their wounds, prepared medicines with herbs from her garden, provided them with food, and above all, offered them the comfort of her word, imbued with divine love. More than once she gave her own bed to a seriously ill person, spending the night in prayer beside the makeshift bed. Indigenous people and African slaves, who constituted the most despised strata of colonial society, found in Rosa a true defender and friend. Deeply hurt by the unjust situation of these less fortunate brothers and sisters, the saint not only provided them with material help, but also taught them the truths of the Catholic faith, preparing them to receive the sacraments and helping them discover their dignity as children of God. Many natives and slaves, drawn to Rosa's radiant goodness, approached her to listen to her teachings and find relief from their physical and spiritual sufferings. Saint Rosa's concern for the needy led her to found, with the help of her confessor and some pious people, a kind of shelter for abandoned children and the elderly. In a small house near her own, equipped with the most essential things, these helpless beings who wandered the streets of Lima without a roof or sustenance were sheltered. There, under the saint's direction, they were provided with food, clothing, and above all, religious instruction and affection. This work, begun with very meager resources but with unlimited trust in divine providence, can be considered the first charitable institution founded by a woman in the Americas, a precursor to so many others that would arise throughout the continent. Rosa's spirit of charity wasn't limited to corporal works of mercy. It extended to spiritual works as well. perhaps even more necessary in that colonial society where religious ignorance was frequent. With admirable patience, the saint taught the catechism to children and adults, explaining the mysteries of faith in simple words, helping them understand the greatness of divine love. Her pedagogical method, based more on example than words, proved extraordinarily effective. Those who listened were not only instructed, but also moved to live according to the gospel teachings. Drawn by the luminous testimony of this young woman who radiated Christ through every pore of her being. Chapter 11. Sanctified Illness. The final years of Saint Rosa's earthly life were marked by illnesses that tested her patience and surrender to God's will to the extreme. A multitude of physical ailments, aggravated by her rigorous penances, confined her to a bed of suffering from which she could barely rise to attend Holy Mass at the nearby Santo Domingo church. Persistent fevers, acute joint pain, digestive disorders that prevented her from eating properly, and above all, a mysterious illness that caused intense headaches, turned her days and nights into a prolonged martyrdom, uniting her ever more closely to Christ crucified. Rosa's attitude toward illness was one of loving acceptance, even of supernatural joy. She saw in her sufferings not punishment, but a privilege, a participation in the redemptive cross of her divine spouse. Lord, increase my pains, but also increase my love, was her constant prayer during the most acute crises of her illness. This inner disposition transformed physical suffering into a source of spiritual merit, not only for her, but for the entire church. For Rosa offered her sufferings for the conversion of sinners, the perseverance of the just, and the propagation of the Catholic faith in the Americas. Despite her extreme weakness, the saint continued to practice charity toward others. From her sickbed, she counseled those who visited her, prayed for the intentions entrusted to her, and even found the strength to make small handicrafts that she then sold to help the poor. Her room became a place of pilgrimage for people of all social classes in Lima, drawn by her reputation for holiness and her gift of counsel. A young woman who, amidst unspeakable pain, radiated peace and supernatural joy. Many left there not only comforted, but also inwardly transformed by contact with a soul so evidently united to God. The doctors attending Rosa were amazed at the strength with which she endured the treatments of the time, often more painful than the illnesses themselves. Without any anesthesia, the saint subjected her body to bloodletting, cauterization, and other extremely painful procedures. Without ever hearing a complaint or a groan from her lips, this attitude deeply impressed the physicians, some of whom later confessed that contemplating such patients had been a more eloquent lesson on God's presence than all the sermons they had ever heard. Medical science, powerless against the advance of the disease, finally acknowledged that Saint Rosa's case transcended natural laws. An organism so weakened by penances and ailments should have succumbed much sooner. But a mysterious force sustained that frail existence, allowing her to complete the mission that Providence had entrusted to her. This supernatural resistance to physical suffering was, for those around her, further proof of God's favor toward Rosa, and a confirmation of the authenticity of her spiritual journey. Illness, accepted and lived with love, thus became the final rung on the ladder that would lead the Limena saint to a definitive encounter with her beloved. Chapter 12. The Glorious Passing. As her illness worsened, Saint Rosa perceived with ever greater clarity the imminent encounter with her divine spouse. With the serenity of one who had lived each day in preparation for eternity, the Limena Virgin arranged everything necessary for her departure from this world. She requested the last sacraments, which she received with indescribable fervor, and asked to be transferred to the home of a noble lady, Doña Maria de Uzategui, so as not to cause further inconvenience to her family during the last days of her illness. This separation from her loved ones was a painful sacrifice for Rosa, which she offered generously, adding it to all those that had marked her earthly existence. Saint Rosa's final days were a sublime testament to abandonment in God's hands. Although the physical pains intensified to barely bearable limits, her face reflected a celestial peace that impressed all who approached her bed. "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me," she repeated when someone marveled at her strength in the face of suffering. Her hours were spent in loving conversations with Christ crucified, whose image she never let go of, and tender conversations with the Blessed Virgin Mary, whom she constantly invoked as mother and protector. Her confessor, a privileged witness to these moments, would later affirm that he had never witnessed a death so holy, nor one so full of teachings on the true meaning of Christian life. News of Rosa's imminent departure spread rapidly throughout Lima, causing deep commotion. Crowds of people from all social classes flocked to the house where the saint was dying, eager to receive her last blessing or to entrust her with some intention for when she was in God's presence. Amidst tears and prayers, the entire city spiritually accompanied the one they already considered their heavenly protector. The convents of the city organized continuous prayer shifts, begging the Lord that, if it were His will, He would prolong that precious existence that did so much good from her sickbed. Finally, on August 24th, 1617, the feast day of St. Bartholomew the Apostle, when Rosa was only 31 years old, her most pure soul departed from her martyred body to fly to meet her spouse. According to eyewitness accounts, her face, at the moment of her passing, took on a supernatural beauty, a smile of unspeakable sweetness etched on her lips as she uttered her final words, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus, be with me." A gentle fragrance of roses filled the room, a phenomenon many interpreted as a sign of Christ's presence, coming to claim His faithful bride, to usher her into the banquet of eternal marriage. The death of Saint Rose, far from being an end, marked the beginning of her true mission. As a heavenly intercessor for the city of Lima and for all of the Americas, the people, with that supernatural intuition that characterizes simple faith, immediately understood that they had a powerful advocate in heaven, someone who knew firsthand their needs and sufferings, and who would continue to watch over them from glory. The miracles that began to occur near the saint's body, even before her burial, confirmed this popular conviction, transforming the funeral into a true manifestation of Christian faith and hope, more like a triumphant procession than a funeral cortege. Chapter 13. A Prayer to Saint Rose of Lima. O glorious Saint Rose of Lima, first flower of holiness in the New World, and fragrant rose of Christ's garden, to you we come with filial confidence, sure of your powerful intercession before the throne of the Most High. You, who in life were a perfect model of Christian virtues, help us to follow in your footsteps on the path to sainthood. Obtain for us, blessed Rose, the grace to love God above all things, as you loved Him from your tender infancy to your last breath. Teach us to seek true beauty, not the outward beauty that fades with time, but the inner beauty that endures eternally. May we learn from you to despise the vanities of the world and to value the imperishable goods of the Spirit. You, who lived in perfect union with the crucified Christ, obtain for us the strength necessary to embrace our own crosses with love, that in times of trial and suffering we may know, like you, the loving hand of God, purifying us and preparing us for eternal glory. Help us to understand the redemptive value of suffering offered in love, transforming it into a source of merit for ourselves and for the whole Church. Patron saint of the Americas and the Philippines, protect with your heavenly mantle all the peoples who venerate you. Intercede for our leaders, that they may work with honesty and justice for the common good, for families, that they may be sanctuaries of love and schools of virtue for young people, that they may discover their vocation and respond generously to God's call for the sick and the poor, whom you loved so much on earth, that they may find comfort in their suffering and help in their needs. We beseech you, Saint Rose, to bless especially your city of Lima and all of Peru, the land you sanctified with your virtues. Watch over the Church in Latin America, that it may remain faithful to the teachings of Christ and be a leaven of evangelical renewal in the midst of society. May your example of love for the Eucharist and the Blessed Virgin Mary inspire us to live our Catholic faith with greater fervor, transmitting it intact to future generations. And when the time comes for our passage to eternity, assist us with your motherly presence, as you assisted so many dying during your earthly life. Help us to prepare ourselves worthily for the definitive encounter with the Lord, so that we may, like you, breathe our last uttering the sweet name of Jesus and awaken in his loving arms for all eternity. Amen. Saint Rose of Lima, patron saint of the Americas and the Philippines, pray for us.